Good morning. And thank you very much for being here this morning. I really appreciate everyone's time, and it's wonderful to be in Leiden. It's my first time here. I have been to the Netherlands before, but what a joy to be in such an amazing venue. And I, on the way here, heard that this university has been here for around 450 years, and I'm absolutely delighted to be able to share with you this morning my thoughts around my book that was mentioned earlier. Yesterday evening, I was privileged enough to participate in a dinner where a person who will remain nameless said that not too long ago, about a week ago, that the Netherlands celebrated 50 years of the development community. And frankly, I was really stunned. I'm not sure what there is to celebrate. Given the experiences of Africa specifically, but the developing world in general, one actually should not be celebrating, but rather sitting back and questioning what has happened in the past 60 years. What I thought I would do this morning is to start off by sharing with you a couple of the things that have occurred to me as I've been traveling around the world in the last 9 months. And then talk to you a little bit about why it is I believe that aid is not working and it is not the way forward in helping Africa and African countries to achieve long-term economic growth and to meaningfully reduce poverty. I would like to start off by saying that there are at least 3 things that I believe that we as a global society agree on. The first thing I think we all agree on is that we do not want Africa to be dependent on aid forever. I think we all would like to see a time where Africa and African countries and Africans become equal partners on the global stage, and that we can get rid of this us and them sort of donor-recipient culture. By the way, if anybody thinks that we would like to see Africa continue to be in poverty, you can put your hand up and stop me. The second thing I believe that we agree on is that we need African governments to be serious. We need African governments to take their responsibilities of providing public goods such as education, healthcare, infrastructure, and security. It is the responsibility of African governments to do that, and very much in the way that, being from the Netherlands, you expect the Dutch government to provide those things for you. Africans, too, expect their governments to provide public goods to them. However, as I will discuss later, it is very well known that these public goods are not being provided by African governments. They are in fact being provided by the international community. So we should be asking ourselves, what kind of society are we building in Africa? Particularly because it's different from the societies that you as international, part of the international community, as part of being from donor countries, you are living and enjoying a different life from the one that you are actually pushing onto the African continent. But the point here that shouldn't be missed is that we want African governments to take the lead. It doesn't matter if we as individuals or as Western governments want to help Africa. If African governments are not being serious about creating jobs, about creating growth and reducing poverty, it actually doesn't matter. The third thing that we agree upon, and I must say this, I have to confess this actually was not my point. I was invited to Norway not too long ago to meet with the Minister of International Development, Minister Sondheim. Some of you might be aware, Norway gives 1% of its income to aid. So I was invited to go to Norway, and the minister made this following point. He said, we have to accept, whether we like it or not, that aid has contributed to the dysfunctionality of African governments. Now, I would like to say here that given the second point, where we need African governments to be in the forefront of leading the charge for development, this is a particularly worrying statement, that aid has contributed to the dysfunctionality of African governments. You might be asking yourselves, how? And one of the themes that I will pick up on through my presentation this morning is that in the worst case scenario, we know that African governments, not all of them, but many of them, have been involved in blatant and outright stealing of aid money. But even in the best case scenario, where you have good governments that have good intentions about trying to reduce poverty amongst their people, we still have a fundamental problem in that African governments have been allowed to abdicate their responsibility of providing public goods. As I said earlier, things like education and healthcare, infrastructure and security across much of Africa are actually provided by the international community. And bearing in mind, we need to ask ourselves, what sort of situation are we trying to perpetuate? So we agree on these three things. The question then becomes, how do we approach a situation where we can meaningfully put a dent in poverty and create growth? Before I launch into the core of my material, I'd like to say a few other things. First of all, I'd like to explain to the audience what it is I mean by aid. In the book, I explain very clearly that in my mind, there are essentially three types of aid. There's what we would call humanitarian or emergency aid. And I think what has happened in Indonesia in the past 10 days is a reminder of the importance of that type of aid. And this is the type of aid that you would send because there's been a tsunami or an earthquake or a flood somewhere around the world. My view is that as a global community, we have a moral imperative to act when people, wherever they may be in the world, are suffering because of a calamity, such as a tsunami or floods and so on. The second type of aid is what I would call NGO or charitable aid, and this is relatively small beer. The small monies that are sent to, for example, Africa for a girl to go to school, or money that we send for somebody to build a well. The reality is, this type of aid is not going to get Africa to grow at the levels of economic growth so that we can put a dent in poverty and ensure that there'll be jobs for Africans going forward. I must tell you, and I must confess, that I myself am involved in a number of charities, I often spend time talking with my fellow board members about the fact that we have to remember that even with good intentions, we are not going to meaningfully overhaul the African system by sending little monies. In fact, if anything, it really just makes us feel better rather than actually transforming lives of people on the ground. It's a hard reality to accept, but it's the stark reality, and it is the truth. The third type of aid is the aid that I'm actually criticizing in my book, and these are the $1 billion of aid that go every year from government to governments, but also from international institutions such as the World Bank and IMF to African governments. I will say that humanitarian aid and charitable aid do have their problems, but that is not the essence of the book that I have written. The book I have written is really targeting these $1 billion packages, which right now are anywhere between $75 to $100 billion every year to Africa. I would also just like to say, and to ask the audience to think back to the time when the idea of aid was originally invented. This is post-World War II. This was in the era of the Bretton Woods institutions, and it was also the era when many African countries and countries around the world were coming out of colonialism. At that time, and many of the people in this room who are economists will be familiar with a very simple economic equation that savings leads to investment and leads to growth. The problem was that policymakers of the day said, unfortunately, these small countries that have just been recently created and are recently independent do not have savings. So instead of savings leading to investment and therefore leading to growth, why don't we give them aid? And I must confess, if I had been a policymaker in the 50s and 60s, I probably would have been a big supporter of aid. It made sense. However, here we are now 60 years later with over $1 trillion of aid that has gone to Africa. And the question we should be asking ourselves is, has aid worked? Has it improved the livelihoods of Africans? Has it increased growth? Has it reduced poverty? And the reality is, no, it has not. Let's take a look at some statistics. With respect to growth, for example, African countries, by and large, are worse off than they were 40 years ago, in terms of per capita income and in terms of even growth rates. If you look at poverty, in the 1970s, 10% of African people lived on less than $1 a day. Today, over 70% of Africans live on less than $1 a day. This is after $1 trillion of aid money has gone to Africa. I would also remind the audience that there is not a single country on earth, anywhere, that has achieved long-term economic growth and meaningfully reduced poverty by relying on aid to the extent that African countries rely on aid today. The Netherlands has not achieved economic success by relying on aid. Neither has the United States, neither has much of Western Europe, or even places like China, India, Russia, Brazil, and closer to home, South Africa. So, we must ask ourselves, as global citizens, why it is that we are pushing a strategy of economic development that has no evidence whatsoever of working to create the jobs that Africa and Africans so desperately need. It's interesting to see so many young people here in the audience. Over 60% of Africans are under the age of 24. In my home country, the life expectancy is 37. And I'm constantly reminded that I'm actually over that age now, so I feel very fortunate. But this is what we need. People who have traveled to Africa in this room will be very familiar going to the main metropoles in Africa, whether it's Lagos or Nairobi or Lusaka, that there are many, many young people. Some of them have even accomplished up to through high school, who are on the streets selling trinkets, T-shirts, CDs. I'm sure, I can see some people nodding, I'm sure you'll be familiar with this picture. That is unsustainable. In another 10 years, not only will those young people be on the street, but also their children will be on the streets. The risk of having more failed states such as Somalia, increased political instability in Africa is very high, given that there are not jobs being created on the ground. Let me talk very specifically about some of the reasons why aid doesn't work. And I have a list here which I called the top 10 reasons why aid doesn't work. But I've decided I'm not going to tell you all of them so that you can actually be encouraged to go and buy the book. But let me give you some flavor for some of the critiques of aid. I should tell you that this is not evidence that Dambisa Moyo has cooked up in her kitchen. This is evidence that is very well known by the development community, very well cited by organizations such as the World Bank and the IMF. And in the book, I actually do give citations of their own literature on why and how it is that aid is not delivering what we would like to see. But let's go through some of the key points. The first one, and it's the most obvious one, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, is the fact that aid has fueled corruption in Africa. And it actually is the worst form of corruption. Now, very often people turn around and say, oh, but Dambisa, that's an old story, that's from the 70s. Unfortunately, no, it is not. Even today, we still are grappling with many, many corrupt governments. It is no surprise that organizations such as Transparency International, if you look at their corruption perceptions index, African countries consistently are at the bottom of the worst ranked countries. Even in my own country, Zambia, very recently, the Zambian president has been embroiled in a political scandal of money being stolen. Next door to Zambia is Malawi. $12 million has been found to be stolen by the former government. This pattern of theft continues today. The key point here is that giving money at any time to anyone for free with no constraints, as we've seen, and I'm sure ABN AMRO and other institutions like that are good examples of this, means that you have no checks and balances, and at that point, the manner in which people behave without a governance structure leads and can lead into corrupt practices. The second problem are things like inflation. There is a very clear literature that pushing large amounts of aid into developing countries, especially small countries like the ones in Africa, ends up increasing inflation. It also increases the debt burden, which we're all very familiar with, that African countries very often are laden with enormous amounts of debt. And even when some of us feel compassionate that we should have debt relief, the strategy is so absurd that we cancel the debt and we simply reload with new aid. Nothing fundamentally is changing. Another problem with aid going into Africa and the amounts that it does are things like Dutch disease, and it's very apropos to be in the Netherlands, and I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with the concept of Dutch disease, which is a phenomenon where large amounts of money going into an economy can actually kill off the domestic export sector, but also has knock-on effects to other parts of the economy. Again, very well researched, the links between aid and Dutch disease across poor countries. However, people tend to turn a blind eye and to continue to push the agenda of let's give aid to Africa. There are a whole host of other problems, things like the fact that African governments abdicate their responsibilities, as I said. This point I will come back to in a moment because there's a very key point about accountability and the fact that African governments should be accountable to the African people, but instead they spend almost all their time, or most of their time, catering and courting international donors and NGOs, and with little concern for the welfare of their people. There is very little surprise to me that African countries consistently remain as the worst ranked countries where entrepreneurship is concerned. If you look at the World Bank doing business around the world surveys, in some cases it can take up to 2 years to get a business license. This does not sound to me like a formula for countries that are keen to get growth going and jobs created for their citizens. Again, there are strong linkages to aid on this state in this way. In the Netherlands, again, for example, and in more developed economies, the government creates a symbiotic relationship with its people. So the government taxes the individuals, and in return, people expect the government to provide public goods. That is not the case in Africa. In Africa, the government does not tax us. They court and have a relationship with international donors who provide them with the money. A couple more points here. There is some research, which I cite in the book, of how aid fuels civil wars and civil unrest. In the past year, Africa has had 4 coups d'etats, overthrowing of governments. And in the 1990s, Africa had more civil unrest and civil wars than the rest of the world put together. This pattern of failed states and civil unrest continues today, and I can assure you will continue as long as Africans do not have a vested interest and opportunities for development in their own countries. If there's one thing that I hope that you remember, and you can forget everything else I said, is the fact that aid disenfranchises Africans. It's no surprise to me that you very rarely hear from an African leader about what the plan is for the African continent. In the United States, they have a saying, which is around the Boston Tea Party, which goes, there's no taxation without representation. In Africa, we have the opposite problem, what I would call the opposite Boston Tea Party. We have no representation because there's no taxation. African governments do not tax the population, nor do they try to grow the private sector and entrepreneurship, and so they spend most of their time basically getting money to stay in office for as much as 40 years. 20, 30, 40 years is quite possible and quite common in Africa, simply because they do not tax the local population. They do not have to care that they do not provide goods and services to the Africans. I can see a big screen here telling me I've got 2 minutes left, so I won't really spend much time talking about the alternative ways of financing development, but I have spent time in the book outlining some of the things that could be done instead to encourage ways for African governments to finance economic development. At a time when America is facing a 10% unemployment rate and borrowing from China, at a time where Britain, one of the major donors to Africa, is suffering under 60% of GDP levels of debt. This is not the time to expect that donor countries are going to open their accounts to give more aid money. Even if they wanted to, they have their own financial pressures. We as Africans have to be serious about the fact that there could come a day very soon, particularly given the demographic shifts that are happening across Western Europe, and then across the United States and affecting the donor communities. We have to be serious about finding alternative ways to finance economic development. The good news is that there are alternative ways. There's a lot of evidence that countries that rely on more trade have been more successful than many African countries, where tariff rates amongst African countries tend to be in the double digits. Yes, it's true that European countries and America do keep African goods out of your countries. However, there should be other ways for us to sell the produce that we do produce, such as primary goods. Things like foreign direct investment, the capital markets, microfinance, remittances, savings, taxes are all things that we should be talking about in terms of helping African governments get off of the drug of aid and to start taking responsibility for providing goods and services to their people. One of the things that happened to me on my book tour this year that's been incredibly distressing was a meeting that I had at the IMF with very senior members there, when they told me that after 50 years of independence for most African countries, there are only 2 countries in sub-Saharan Africa that the governments feel comfortable, that the IMF feels comfortable leaving for the governments to put even a business plan together about the strategy that they would approach for any sector, whether it's education or healthcare. As it stands right now, it seems that most African countries and leadership have taken a back seat. They're very relaxed because somebody else from the international community is going to do the dirty work for them. My policy, and I've got a big 0 staring at me right now, in front of me now, telling me I'm done. I'm going to make 2 last points. The first question is, what exactly is the policy initiative that I'm suggesting? To the extent that aid has worked, I think we can all agree it has tended to be short, sharp, and finite. The Marshall Plan is a classic example of that. It was $100 billion in today's terms. It was a 5-year program. The money came in, it went for reconstruction, and then that was the end. The problem in Africa is that it's an open-ended commitment. Nobody wants to talk about the fact that someday we're going to have to exit from the aid dependency, and everybody wants to talk about giving more money when actually there will be less money over time to give. I'm going to end off with a quote from a Nigerian friend of mine who was saying to me, Dambisa, why are you wasting your time writing this book? Nobody cares, nobody's going to be interested, everybody knows that aid doesn't work, but actually people don't really care. His specific quote was the following. He said, Africa is to development what Mars is to NASA. He said, every year we spend hundreds of millions of dollars doing experiments, writing research, people driving down to Africa to go and figure out how to alleviate poverty, but actually, nobody ever thinks that we really are going to live on Mars. And the problem is that nobody really believes that Africa is ever going to develop. I thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.